It is the middle of the night in a kingdom built on a river, and an old man is being lowered by ropes into a hole in the ground. You can hear it before you can see it. The low, restless sound of something pacing in the dark below him. Stone scrapes against stone as a slab swings shut over his head. And then, silence. We will get to that night. Hold on to it. But not yet, because that man was not always old, and this story does not start in a pit. It starts decades earlier, in chains, on a road leading away from everything he had ever known. You don't know his name yet. You will. Picture a teenage boy walking in a line of captives toward the gates of the most powerful city on earth. You can almost feel the dust under his sandals, the chains heavier than anything he has ever carried before. His name is Daniel, a Hebrew name that means God is my judge, and that name is about to become a problem. Because the men marching him toward the palace are about to take it away. You need to understand something about Babylon before you go any further. This was not some backwater outpost. This was the center of the civilized world, a city of hanging gardens, brick towers 100 feet high, and gods carved into every gate you walked through. The Babylonians did not conquer nations and leave them as they were. They conquered minds. And the first mind they wanted to conquer belonged to a Hebrew teenager who had just watched his homeland fall. Daniel was not alone. 3 friends walked beside him: Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. You will get to know all 3 of them well before this is over. Within days, even their names would be gone, replaced with Babylonian ones built to honor Babylonian gods. That is where this story actually begins. Not in a furnace, not in a lion's den. In a quiet, almost bureaucratic decision about what to call 4 young men. Because whoever controls your name starts to believe he controls you. This is not a story about a dream. This is not a story about a furnace. This is not a story about a king's pride. This is a story about a teenage exile who refused to bow to anyone for 70 years, and the 4 kings who found out exactly what that refusal would cost them. Stay with me. Because the bowing starts almost immediately. And it does not start with an idol. It starts with dinner. The Babylonians did not believe in subtlety. If they wanted to own you, they started with your name. Lose your name long enough, and you start to wonder if you have lost yourself along with it. Daniel became Belteshazzar. Bel protect his life. Bel being the chief god of Babylon, so that every single time a palace official called him to a meeting, he was being quietly invited to switch which god he answered to. Hananiah became Shadrach. Mishael became Meshach. Azariah became Abednego, servant of Nebo, another Babylonian god, stitched right into his new identity like a brand. Here's what most people miss about what happened next. It wasn't a confrontation. It was a dinner table. The 4 of them were assigned the king's own food and the king's own wine, a portion meant to honor them, fatten them, and quietly bind them to the king's table the way a vassal binds himself to his lord. And Daniel said no, not loudly, not with a speech. He simply asked the official in charge for permission to eat vegetables and drink water instead for 10 days, just to see what would happen. You can imagine the official's face. This was not a request men made in Nebuchadnezzar's court. Refuse the king's table, and you risked everything. Your standing, maybe your life, over a plate of vegetables. 10 days later, Daniel and his 3 friends looked healthier than every young man who had eaten from the palace kitchen. The first test was not a furnace. It was a meal nobody else thought mattered. You might assume a plate of vegetables couldn't matter much in a place like this. It mattered more than almost anything else he could have refused. But it gets stranger, because the next test almost got every wise man in Babylon executed. And at first, Daniel wasn't even told what the crime was. Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. It shook him so badly he couldn't sleep. And when he called in his magicians and astrologers the next morning, he didn't just ask them to interpret it. He demanded they tell him the dream itself, with no details given, or be torn limb from limb. You can picture the room going cold. These were men whose entire careers were built on reading omens, and not one of them could read a mind. They told the king, honestly, that what he was asking was impossible for any man on earth. Nebuchadnezzar didn't care. He gave the order: execute every wise man in Babylon. Daniel and his 3 friends were on that list. Men who had done nothing but exist in the wrong profession were about to die for a dream they had never even heard described. You can imagine what that felt like for Daniel, discovering he was on a death list over a dream nobody had bothered to tell him. Daniel asked for one night. He went home and he prayed with Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, not for safety, but for the answer itself. And God gave it to him. The dream was a towering statue, a head of gold, a chest and arms of silver, a belly and thighs of bronze, legs of iron, and feet mixed with iron and clay. And then a stone, not thrown by any human hand, that struck the statue's feet and brought the entire thing crashing down before growing into a mountain that filled the whole earth. Daniel told the king what the statue meant: kingdom after kingdom, rising and falling, growing weaker and more divided with each one. Babylon's own gold head among them. Until one final kingdom, set up by God himself, would outlast every empire that had ever existed. Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face in front of a captive teenager and called his God the God of gods. The execution order was canceled. Every wise man in Babylon owed his life to a young man who hadn't even been allowed to keep his own name. Pay attention to this, because the king learned the wrong lesson from it, almost immediately. Years later, Nebuchadnezzar built a golden image, 90 feet tall by some estimates, and ordered every official in the empire to fall on their faces and worship it the moment the music played. Everyone obeyed. Everyone except 3 men. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stood in a sea of bowing bodies, the only 3 figures left standing, while informants ran to the king to report exactly what and who they'd seen. Nebuchadnezzar gave them one more chance: bow or burn. Their answer is one of the most quoted lines in the entire Bible. The God they served was able to save them from the flames. But even if he chose not to, they still would not bow. Not maybe. Not probably. They walked into a furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual, with no guarantee of the ending, because the ending was never the reason they refused to bow in the first place. You don't say something like that unless you have already made peace with how it ends. When Nebuchadnezzar looked into the flames, he counted 4 men walking around inside them, unbound, unburned. And one of them, by his own description, looked like a son of the gods. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego walked out without so much as the smell of smoke on their clothes. The king who had ordered an execution issued a new decree instead. No one was allowed to speak against their God. 3 tests. 3 times Daniel and his friends refused to bend. And in every single case, the bowing was never really about a meal or a dream or a statue. It was about who actually sat on the throne. So far, you've watched one king run the same test 3 times in 3 different shapes and lose every single time. A meal, a dream, a statue. Each time, the answer was the same. And each time, the God behind that answer showed up louder than the throne that was threatening these men. If you're starting to see the pattern here, you're exactly where this video wants you. There's one more king coming, and then a third, and the stakes only go up from here. If a video like this is worth your time, hit subscribe before we keep going. It actually helps a channel like this more than you'd think. And drop a comment telling me which test so far you think you'd have failed. Be honest. Because the next king doesn't lose his temper. He loses his entire kingdom in one night. Nebuchadnezzar had been told, in plain language, by a captive teenager, that every empire eventually falls, including his. You'd think that lesson would stick. It didn't. You have probably watched this exact pattern in someone you know. Quiet success curdling, slowly, into something uglier. Years passed. Daniel rose higher in the court. And then Nebuchadnezzar had a second dream, and this one was about him personally. He saw a tree, enormous, visible from every corner of the earth, full enough that birds nested in its branches and animals sheltered under it. Then a voice from heaven ordered it cut down, stripped the branches, scattered the leaves, but leave the stump bound in the ground, because this tree was going to live like an animal in the open fields for a set period of time, until it learned exactly who actually rules. Daniel was the only one who could interpret it, and for a moment he didn't want to. He stood in front of the king and hesitated, because the tree was Nebuchadnezzar himself. The dream meant the most powerful man on earth was about to lose his mind, his throne, and his dignity, until he openly admitted that the Most High God, not Nebuchadnezzar, runs the affairs of every kingdom on the planet. A year went by. Nothing happened. You can imagine Nebuchadnezzar starting to believe he'd dodged it. Until one afternoon, walking on the roof of his own palace, he looked out over the city he'd built and said the exact words you'd expect a man who'd just escaped a warning to say. "Look at this. I built this, by my own power, for my own glory." The words weren't even finished leaving his mouth before the warning came true. His mind broke. He was driven from his palace, ate grass like cattle in an open field, and lived that way for years, hair grown out like feathers, nails grown out like claws, while the empire he'd built carried on without him. And this is where it gets remarkable. Because when his mind was finally restored, Nebuchadnezzar didn't go back to bragging. He wrote his own testimony into the official record, in his own words, praising the King of Heaven, the same God a captive Hebrew teenager had been pointing him toward for decades. Because everything that God does is just, and he humbles the proud. The most powerful man in the ancient world ended his story on his knees, not on a throne. Hold that thought, because his successors did not learn from it at all. Years later, a different king sat on Babylon's throne, Belshazzar, ruling alongside his father in the city's final stretch as the dominant power on earth. And one night, he threw an enormous feast for 1,000 of his nobles. At some point in the drinking, Belshazzar made a decision that should have felt like a small detail and turned out to be the worst choice of his life. He called for the gold and silver cups his father's father had looted from the temple in Jerusalem, sacred vessels set apart for the worship of one God, and he used them to toast the gods of gold, silver, iron, wood, and stone in front of the entire court. The moment the wine touched those cups, fingers appeared. Not a hand, not an arm, just fingers, writing directly onto the plaster wall in plain view of the king. The candlelight throwing the shadow of letters no one in the room could read. You can imagine the silence that dropped over that hall the instant everyone realized what they were looking at. Belshazzar's face went pale. His knees, by the Bible's own description, literally started knocking together. Every astrologer in his court stared at the wall and had nothing.
Do not be afraid, my lord.
Here's the part nobody tells you. The Queen Mother is the one who remembered Daniel, by then an old man, decades removed from the events you've already watched, mostly forgotten by a new generation in the palace. Daniel was brought in, offered rewards, and turned every single one of them down before he'd even read the wall. He reminded Belshazzar, point blank, what had happened to Nebuchadnezzar, the very story you just watched, and told the king he'd known all of it and still chose pride over reverence. Then he read the words, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin, in Aramaic, the language of the Babylonian court itself. Numbered, weighed, divided. Belshazzar's days were numbered. He'd been weighed and found lacking. And his kingdom was about to be divided between the Medes and the Persians. For a long time, skeptics pointed to Belshazzar as proof the book of Daniel was unreliable. No outside record even mentioned a king by that name. Then, in 1854, archaeologists uncovered a small clay cylinder from the ruins of ancient Ur, written in Nabonidus' own name, that confirmed exactly what the Bible had already said. Nabonidus left his son Belshazzar in Babylon as co-regent while he was away. 2,500 years later, a buried piece of clay backed up the story. That same night, the writing appeared on the wall. Belshazzar was killed, and the most powerful empire on earth changed hands before sunrise. There's one more thing you need to know before this story reaches its hardest test. The man who took the throne after Babylon fell genuinely liked Daniel, which is exactly why what happens next is so hard to watch. The man who took Babylon's throne was named Darius, and unlike the kings before him, he didn't need to be humbled. He liked Daniel immediately, enough to put him in charge of the entire kingdom, second only to the throne itself, while Daniel was already in his 80s. And that promotion is exactly what set the trap in motion. The other officials under Darius couldn't stand it. An old foreign exile, outranking every native-born Persian and Mede in the empire. They went looking for something to use against him. Some mistake, some corruption, some failure in his record. Now watch what happens next, because they searched and found absolutely nothing. Daniel's work was clean. So they did the only thing left available to them. They didn't attack his job. They attacked his God. They knew exactly one habit Daniel had kept every single day for decades. 3 times a day, he opened the window of his upper room, faced toward Jerusalem, and prayed. The same posture, the same direction, the same hours, regardless of which king sat on the throne or which empire ruled the region. So the officials went to Darius with a flattering proposal. Issue a decree that for the next 30 days, no one in the kingdom may pray to any god or any man except the king himself, on penalty of being thrown into the den of lions. And under Medo-Persian law, once a king sealed a decree like that with his own signet ring, not even the king himself had the power to undo it. Darius signed it. He had no idea what he'd just done. Daniel heard about the decree. And then, this is the detail that should stop you cold. He went home, opened the same window he'd opened for years, faced the same direction, and prayed at the same hour, exactly as he'd always done. Not in secret, not behind a curtain, in full view of anyone watching for it. The officials were watching for it. They brought it straight to Darius, and you can feel the king's stomach drop in the text itself. He realized immediately what his own flattery-blinded signature had done to the one man in his kingdom he trusted most. He spent the rest of the day trying to find some legal way out of his own law. There wasn't one. As the sun went down, Daniel was lowered by ropes into a stone pit, and a slab was rolled over the opening, sealed with the king's own signet ring so that no one, not even Darius, could open it without being caught tampering with it. This is the night you saw at the very beginning of this video. The old man, the ropes, the sound of something pacing in the dark below him. You're standing in that exact moment now. Darius went back to his palace and refused every comfort available to a king. No food, no entertainment. He couldn't sleep. At the first light of dawn, he ran, not walked, ran, back to the den, and called out into the dark with something close to desperation in his voice. Daniel, servant of the living God, was your God able to save you from the lions? And a voice answered him out of the pit. This is not a story about luck. This is not a story about coincidence. This is not a story about one old man simply outsmarting a den of starving animals. This is a story about a God who closed the mouths of those lions before Daniel even reached the floor of that pit. Because, as Daniel told the king, he had been found innocent before his God, and innocent before the king had never stopped serving either.
I trust in you, my king.
They pulled Daniel out, and there wasn't a single mark on him. Not one. The men who'd engineered the trap were thrown into that same den in his place. And Darius, the king who'd nearly destroyed the one man he trusted most, issued a new decree to the entire empire, commanding everyone, everywhere, to fear and reverence the God of Daniel, the living God whose kingdom will never be destroyed.
A proclamation from the
Centuries later, a German pastor named Dietrich Bonhoeffer sat in a Nazi prison cell, having refused to bow to a regime that demanded total allegiance, writing letters to people he loved without any idea whether he'd survive the year. He didn't know how his story would end. Daniel didn't know either, standing in that den in the dark. Neither of them refused to bow because they were guaranteed a rescue. They refused because some thrones were never theirs to bow to in the first place. Daniel's story doesn't actually end with the lions. He lived years longer, And at some point, an angel named Gabriel came to him with one final staggering message. A countdown of 70 weeks of years, pointing toward the exact timing of a coming Messiah, centuries before that Messiah would ever walk into Jerusalem. Scholars are still arguing over the math today. And in a separate vision, Daniel was shown the rise of a Greek empire that wouldn't exist for nearly 200 years. A prophecy so specific that, according to the historian Josephus, Alexander the Great himself was shown Daniel's writings when he arrived in Jerusalem, and was so struck by what he read that he spared the city instead of destroying it. So here's what you're actually walking away with. First, the truth of it. 4 kings, 4 tests, and a God who never once lost. Not the food, not the dream, not the furnace, not the writing on the wall, not the den. You have just watched all 4 happen, back to back, across 70 years. Second, what it means for you. The cost of refusing to bow almost never shows up as a furnace. It shows up smaller than that. In a window left open when it would be easier to close it. In a prayer kept on schedule when no one's watching to see if you skip it. Daniel's whole life was decided in moments that small. And third, the one that should actually sit with you. The same God who shut the mouths of those lions before an old man even hit the floor of that pit is the same God watching whatever pit you're standing at the edge of right now. You don't have to know how the story ends to know who's already in it with you. Which test do you think you'd have failed? The food, the statue, the furnace, or the den? Tell me in the comments, honestly. Because in 70 years, across 4 kings and 1 empire collapsing into another, the throne never actually changed. It just took everyone else that long to notice who'd been sitting on it the whole time.